Will Bitcoin hit $1 million by 2030? It's very unlikely. There was a time earlier this decade when you would look at the rate of return and the diminishing returns, and you could make a conclusion based on math that yes, Bitcoin would hit $1 million by 2030. But looking at where we are in this decade and looking how far we have to go, it's very, very unlikely that Bitcoin will hit $1 million by 2030. But if you were to ask that question, will Bitcoin hit $1 million by 2035? I'd be much more on board with the possibility that yes, that is what's going to happen. And looking at where Bitcoin's price is now, that is an 18x from here. And I know for some of you that you might respond and say only an 18x. That is phenomenal returns on a highly trustworthy asset. Now, I do not mean to be discouraging with this video at all. I am very bullish on Bitcoin. Some of you might even look at that date and dollar amount and think that I'm being an absolute moon boy. And you know what? If you want to call me a moon boy on Bitcoin, I'm perfectly fine with that. Others of you might think that I'm being way too conservative. Whatever the case, here's something you've got to understand. If you don't think that Bitcoin is going to zero, which if you're watching this video, there's a good chance that you think Bitcoin is never going to zero again, then it will go to $1 million. It will. I know that seems far-fetched. That seems like a little bit of a stretch. But if you think about Bitcoin, especially in comparison to the stock market, you don't see stock prices typically at $1 million a share. But why is that? That's because of stock splits, multiple stock splits over many years and decades. But if you were to look at some of the most popular stocks and you compare where they were in the 1980s or 1990s, and you factor in the splits, you can easily see something like Microsoft or even Home Depot, which provided phenomenal returns since the 80s. You can see the effects of the stock splits, and you can see that they would be very close to, if not $1 million a share in their 1985 shares. So it's helpful to broaden your horizons. There is a very important comparison that needs to be made with Bitcoin and gold and what's been going on recently that has me very excited about what the future of Bitcoin is going to look like. This may not, it's probably flown under the radar for people, but this recent surge of gold taking center stage, which I believe it's going to outperform the stock market and crypto and Bitcoin over the remainder of this decade. But what we're seeing right now actually started in 2022. So gold, before 2022, before the COVID crash really, and all that excess liquidity that was injected into the market, the amount of gold that was being purchased by central banks around the world was about 500 tons a year. 500 tons. In 2022, and I do think it was in response to the excesses of the injection of liquidity after the COVID crash. But in 2022, that number jumped to 1,000 tons per year of gold being bought by these central banks. And then ever since then, it's been about 1,000 tons. But then when you think about gold and when you think about this recent surge in gold's price, when did it happen? Well, that started to happen in 2024 and then accelerated in a major way in 2025. And it's very likely there will certainly be ups and downs for the remainder of this decade, but it's very likely to continue to accelerate over the remainder of this decade with some cool offs. And we may be in the early stages of some kind of cool off. I don't know. But what does that have to do with Bitcoin? Well, if you think about back to January of 2024, which we're already 26 months removed from, you think about the level of accumulation of Bitcoin that started in January of 2024 with the spot Bitcoin ETFs in the United States, and you think about all these Bitcoin treasury companies that have been established, the fact that the amount of institutions that own Bitcoin has risen dramatically over the last few years. What you're seeing right now in terms of accumulation is something very similar to what you saw with gold starting in 2022. So is it possible that with Bitcoin, we're about 2 years behind gold in terms of this accumulation? But what happens with the initial accumulation, the price does rise, but there's plenty of supply to meet the demand, and the supply gets eaten up to the point where, all right, there's not enough supply left and the price is going to rise. That's going to be reflected in the price. Well, with Bitcoin, the same thing is very likely to happen over the next 5 to 10 years, where all of a sudden, forget about cycles, forget about diminishing returns, we're going to see something similar to what we saw with gold play itself out, where Bitcoin's price rises dramatically and potentially at multiple points this decade becomes the number 2 asset in terms of market class in this world behind gold. So is 2030 too soon for something like that? I tend to think yes, but 2035 makes a lot of sense to me. And even with this idea that, oh no, returns are diminishing, well, we are actually in a new era with Bitcoin accumulation. And we haven't seen, ever since the spot Bitcoin ETFs were launched, we haven't really seen a period of significant injections of liquidity. I mean, the Federal Reserve ended quantitative tightening only in December of 2025, and we're not yet seeing the Fed balance sheet turn positive. And so what happens on the other side of this when rates are lower and when easing begins at some point in the future, when quantitative easing begins and when the stars align more for this massive increase in risk on activity, you're going to see that reflected in Bitcoin's price in ways that you haven't before. So yes, Bitcoin, $1 million one day, probably not 2030, but I would say very likely by 2035.